Hello, and welcome to the Ontario Science Centre's monthly Sensory-Friendly Saturdays live stream presented in partnership with the Geneva Centre for Autism. My name is Rochelle, and I'm an educator at the Ontario Science Centre. Over the next hour, we'll be talking with Neeran Kuni, Director of Social Enterprises and Adult Support Services, Taryn Prasad, Community Facilitator, and Shelley Brazier, Program Director of the Geneva Centre, to talk about the intersection of race and autism and the importance of culturally responsive supports. At any time during the presentation, we invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout and at the end of this the formal part of the presentation. But before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. While I'm presenting to you from my home, I am in Toronto, where the Ontario Science Centre is located. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, and other Anishinaabe nations, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a settler on this land and in spirit of truth and reconciliation, I, and many others at the Ontario Science Centre, commit to respect, listen, learn, and support Indigenous peoples with whom we share this land and who have cared for this land since time immemorial. We further acknowledge the longstanding contributions to the development of Canada by many peoples of African descent who are not settlers, but whose ancestors were forcibly displaced since the arrival of the first named African, Mathieu de Costa, in 1604, and those who arrive previous and subsequent to him. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the land acknowledgement today because it ties in directly to today's theme. For me, land acknowledgements are more than just symbolic gestures. They also serve as a constant reminder, not only of histories that have been overlooked and not taught for whatever reason, but also for those who exist and are overlooked today. Acknowledging this is a first step to taking action to address the inequalities and inequities in our society, and today's session will hopefully help unpack some of this. We are hoping that from wherever you're joining us today, you will take the time to reflect and to learn as much as you can. We have in the chat some resources that are available to you to learn and listen and support as well. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to know a little bit about our audience with the help of our first Zoom poll. It should come up just shortly. We'll give you 30 seconds to answer the poll. We have our Sensory-Friendly Saturday events often attract many different people, and we like to know who is with us today. And I believe everybody has answered. So we'll end the poll. Looks like we have quite a few educators and parent caregivers, individuals with autism, and others. So a lot of those identities and labels that we place on ourselves, they do shape the way we think and the way we interact. So we'd like to keep that in mind while we're talking today. I have another poll. How would you rate your knowledge of autism spectrum disorder? Would you consider yourself very knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, with limited knowledge, or no knowledge? And of course, we welcome all knowledge bases because we're all here to learn. Okay, so people are somewhat knowledgeable. I feel I would put myself somewhat in that camp too. But we're lucky today because we have quite a few experts in this subject. And I would like to begin by asking our first guest, Shelley of the Geneva Centre, to talk a little bit about herself, her role at the Geneva Centre for Autism, and how the Sensory Friendly Saturdays came to be.
Thanks, Rochelle. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Shelley Brazier. I am one of the program directors here at the Geneva Centre for Autism. And for those of you that may not know, Geneva Centre is an agency in the city of Toronto that supports individuals that have an autism spectrum disorder and their families, caregivers, supporters. We have services, a wide range of services for children, youth, adult, parents, educators. So that's a little bit about GCA, and I think the link will be in the chat or in the resources if you want to explore some of our services a little bit more. And just to sort of speak, as Rochelle said, this Sensory Friendly Saturdays is a partnership between the Ontario Science Centre and the Geneva Centre. It started a few years ago, back in 2018, and back then COVID wasn't a thing, and we were hosting these events the first Saturday of every month at the Science Centre, and staff from Geneva Centre would join staff from the Science Centre in putting on activities, workshops, parent discussions, essentially from us here at the Geneva Centre, giving the Science Centre that perspective on the individual and the family, the loved one with an ASD diagnosis, and how they can make their center and their activities more inclusive for everyone. That's a little bit about the partnership. Thanks, Rochelle.
Yeah, it actually has been a very fruitful relationship, and we're hoping that this will continue, just not just on Saturdays too. It is such an important topic. And Shelley, you've brought a colleague with you today. Some of you who have joined us for virtual events may be familiar with Taryn Prasad, also from the Geneva Centre.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taryn Prasad. I'm from the Geneva Centre for Autism, and I'm a community options facilitator, which is a big word for working with families in the community and working specifically with adults with autism. I've been at the Geneva Centre for 16 years, and I spent the majority of my career so far working with children and newly diagnosed children and families with the Early Abilities Program. So I've had many opportunities to speak firsthand to many families experiencing a new diagnosis or just exploring different symptoms and aspects of autism. Very recently, the past, I would say about 5 years, I've been working with adults, and through our program, we work on specific goals like self-help skills, employment, friendship, dating, really anything that would be a specific goal for the community. And I've had the privilege and honor of working one-to-one with adults and hearing firsthand their accounts of having this diagnosis and what that really means. So I look forward today to sharing with you some of my experiences and having this very important discussion. Thank you, Rochelle.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Taryn. And one of the great things about this partnership that we've had with the Geneva Centre is being able to link with other organizations that are also involved in this very important work. And today we have a special guest speaker, Neeran Kuni of the South Asian Autism Awareness Center. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, Neeran.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Good morning, everyone. My name is Neeran Kuni, and I am the Director of Social Enterprise and Adult Support Services at SAAAC Autism Center. SAAAC is a Toronto-based charity that focuses primarily on low-resource families and communities within the Toronto area. We focus our programming and information primarily on individuals with autism and neurodivergent needs as well. SAAAC has been around for quite some time and has had a culturally responsive or culturally sensitive approach during our establishment. We're very proud to be working with communities from the BIPOC communities with a focus on, as I mentioned, the cultural aspect. I'm also the founder of Ubuntu FX, which is a company that designs and implements programs that are socially impactful for individuals who identify as neurodivergent with a passionate focus on the BIPOC community as well. I just wanted to thank the Ontario Science Centre, my fellow panelists, Taryn and Shelley, from the Geneva Centre, as well as Rochelle for hosting this very important discussion. And I'm looking forward to our discussion with you, the audience, as well.
Thank you, Neeran. What struck me about these events that we've been doing online this past year were the subjects that we introduced. The one that had the highest attendance was the webinar that we did in February on the intersection of race and autism. And it was so popular that there was a request to continue the conversation, to create a safer space where everyone can contribute, because it was largely felt that this was not a topic that gets spoken about a lot. So again, throughout this presentation, please feel free to answer or to ask questions in the chat or make comments. You can do that anonymously. And because we'd like to hear your lived experiences or what you have to share or what your thoughts are. It's interesting because we talk about identities a lot and the labels. And I know that for the three of our guests, the labeling and the labels that we don't necessarily put on ourselves, but society places on us can sometimes be a challenge. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, if one of you would like to talk a little bit about how our multiple identities that each one of us has can sometimes affect how we we perceive people with living with autism or who are neurodivergent, and what the implications are for that. Would someone like to start?
Sure. I think what happens is that we tend to have this unconscious bias whenever we walk among our community and within our streets where we live. I think these ideations or perceptions of people sometimes causes hindrance in getting to know somebody. An example is, as we're talking about autism, some of us may view individuals who are autistic as being disabled. Those are very powerful statements that at times are not even true. I think once you get to know someone with autism, and I think with my experience working with individuals with autism, I've come to understand and respect what they have been through in order to be here today. I think with these labels, it's causing this perception that it's almost tragic. It's almost that it's becoming such a prevalent occurrence in today's day and age, where we are labeling people based on their race or their gender or their abilities or any type of label. And I think it's just how our brain works. And I think these types of discussions need to happen in order for us to understand that there first needs to be awareness of this bias that we all have. And I think once we establish that awareness, we can fence that problem and we can build support around that problem so that we can work together to fix it. I think it's a problem that's happening every day. And I think me coming from South Africa, living through apartheid, I can relate to someone with autism because back during the 1990s, and I think apartheid originated around the 1950s or 60s. What happened in that time was I was marginalized based on the color of my skin. My family was also marginalized, and many other racial groups were told what to do, where to live, without really understanding their story. And I think in order for us to combat or work together to figure this out, we need to create this awareness and we need to have more discussions like we're having today.
Yeah, it goes beyond just the labels too, doesn't it? Like it's that the the notion of intersectionality and not being aware of how all our multiple identities, because each and every one of us identifies as more than just our gender, our race, our ethnicity. There's so much that goes into that. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what intersectionality is and how that plays out in so many aspects of daily life. So I have here, we have on the chat, people have not heard of the word, we have quite a few people who have not heard of the word intersectionality before, and that's a good place to start. I think, would somebody like to talk a little bit about what intersectionality is briefly, and how that plays into how people access supports if you have ASD? Perhaps. Shelley?
Hi, yeah, I was going to say, to sort of jump off of, I just want to sort of jump off of what Neeran just said to your question before, Rochelle, is that, we all have this unconscious bias, like everyone has it, and we make these assumptions about people and how we see them and how we interact with them in the spaces that we may bump into these people. And I think, on top of that, what ends up happening is that we don't get to know people for their true selves. So, all of who they are, which we sometimes can see and make assumptions about. Someone can look at me and assume I identify as female, assume that I am Black, so on and so forth. But I'm more than that, right? I'm more than what you can see and how I see myself. And I think, unfortunately, all those unconscious bias is what we place on other people, but then, people then take that back with them and internalize that for themselves, which then bears, impact on how they then see themselves, whether or not they truly see themselves that way. But, I sometimes think about it, we're about one person. So I could look at myself, I could be quite secure in all the identities that I place on me. So, whatever those things might be. But then when we step out of our homes or step out of our own sort of, safe spaces, and we're in the world, we bump into so many people. Like, there's billions of people on the planet. And all of those ideas that those people then place on us sometimes is way more powerful than that one thought we have when we're just thinking about ourselves, when we're by ourselves. So it's quite a circular impact that can be quite, as you said, to use your word, Neeran, tragic, dangerous, because it's not just how others see us and what they impose on us, but that then greatly impacts how we see ourselves, which could be very different from our true self within within ourselves, within our heart, within our own brain. We start to sort of adopt and use those words, labels, boxes that people might put us in. Sorry, I just wanted to sort of jump on that. I don't know, Neeran, I think you were going to talk a little bit about intersectionality. Me to sort of jump in there, but I want to add that piece in.
No problem, Shelley. So intersectionality, it's quite complex, but essentially, it's defined as the interconnected nature of social categories. So we have, for example, on this slide, we can see that people have been categorized under these labels based on their age, their language, their ability, sexuality, skin color, and gender. Intersectionality basically describes this whole element as it's a bit of a hindrance when we have this unconscious bias about these groups. We are considering, or we believe that that it's a one-dimensional unit. Intersectionality says the opposite, that all of these labels interact with each other and they're interconnected in some way, shape, or form. So I could be, for example, people may look at me and may assume that I'm brown, I'm from India, and I've been called very racist terms before. And they assume that I'm from India. In fact, I'm from South Africa. I'm actually consider myself to be African. And I'm about 40 or 50 years old. But I think as we get older, there's also connotations. When I get to about 60 or 70 years old, there are going to be labels on me as well, and they won't be. I won't be regarded as being as abled as someone who's at their prime. So intersectionality considers all of these factors, all these elements, and it really starts to look at the person, not necessarily the label. And I think this is so important to be aware of because it changes the way that we shape, we view everybody. I think if we do not start doing this, or if we don't consider doing stuff like this, as Shelley mentioned, or as I mentioned as well, it becomes tragic. We have this lens on our eyes and in our brains that you automatically know somebody just by looking at them. And there's a quote: "Never judge a book by its cover." And I think that's very true with humanity, that we are doing that. And I think it's time that we start to be aware of this bias, and we can start making some changes.
There was actually a question in the chat, or sorry, the Q&A, because the chat is disabled. Is it necessary to even talk about bias? Like, jumping in would be better? Can we just take it for granted that we're here with interest in equity? So I wonder why focus on bias at all? Can we? I think if it's maybe Shelley or Taryn, if you want to speak to that, in terms of like how sometimes, as Neeran said, the unconscious bias, it's not just an individual thing. It happens at a structural level and in systems that are in place. So I wonder if somebody could speak to that.
You know, I think a big part of all of this is education. And I think that when we look at clients and look at individuals with autism, you know, we're looking at it from the lens of family members. We're looking at it from lived experiences. And the reality is that each and every family member, each and every individual with autism is experiencing all of these versions of intersectionality, and we need to speak about it. You know, we need to have those conversations in order to help support an individual and what their experiences look like. I sat in a meeting and I had a mother who we were talking about dating. We were talking about friendships, and her son was very interested in dating and that as a goal. And this individual, he's a young male who is Black. He is in his 20s, quite large. And there are biases that are assumed by just looking at him. And this individual, so motivated to want to do this goal. And here's this mother who is so fearful of all the biases that are around and what that looks like, knowing that he could say the wrong thing at the wrong time, that police officers could be phoned, that you know, the community might have their own interpretation of things. You know, it's everybody's lived experience, and we need to have those open dialogues like today that we're having right now to be able to share what this looks like so that people really understand what an everyday experience is. I think that it's so important.
Because it's like, as you said, that it impacts on the individual level, but even in terms of data, like collecting that, Shelley, I know you have some information on Canadian statistics, but does it actually break it down by race and gender, some of the more specific challenges that a person of color, you know, a BIPOC person might have?
So we don't have a lot of race-based when we think about, so I'm going to use the example of, you know, a family looking for a diagnosis of autism. They have some concerns around the development of their child. We don't have a lot of good or any really race-based data in Canada. We have some assumed gender-based data around males versus females and things like that. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard that, you know, autism seems to be more diagnosed, at least in early childhood, in males versus females. But if we look to our US counterparts, there has been, so you see up here on I think Rochelle has put up the slide, everyone should be able to see. this is, I think, going back to 2018, so we've got like 1 in 66 youth diagnosed with ASD. Males tend to be 4 times more frequently diagnosed than females. And most, over half, as you can see, get a diagnosis by 6. And so this is some Canadian-based data in getting the diagnosis. But as I said, if we turn to our counterparts in the US, and there has been some studies in the US around looking at race-based data. In particular, I'll find the link and I'll provide it so that it's in the resources. If anyone wants to take a look at the actual study. There was a study done in the Black population in the States, looking at about, I think, approximately 600 families in their journey in getting a diagnosis for their loved one. So an early diagnosis, looking at that sort of early school aged children. And so what this found was over half, or close to half, I think about 50% or 47% of the participants, it took over 3 years for them to get a diagnosis, in comparison to non-Black populations, which received a diagnosis sometimes in under a year, up to a year. And so we're looking at 3 times the length of time that a family has a concern. So they're seeking a diagnosis because they do have a concern around the development of their child, but it's taking sometimes 3 times as long to get that diagnosis. And then of that sort of 47% that took 3 years or more, I think the stat is around, I think it's like, again, close to half, so 45% of that 47% had to seek out 6 or more different clinicians to finally get that diagnosis. So it wasn't that the process, they reached out to their family doctor or went to a hospital or what have you to receive that diagnosis, and it just took a long time. Is that the journey actually got them, they did have these concerns, and so they didn't get, answers from the first clinician, and they continue to seek out other clinicians to finally get that diagnosis. So again, you can imagine this journey, but taking a long time. I have to see multiple doctors, clinicians to finally get this diagnosis for my loved one. And then of those doctors that they're seeing, the majority of them, which I'm sure is not a surprise, I did not look like them, did not reflect who they were, whether it be by race, religion, gender, what have you. And so they also felt in telling their stories, again, multiple times, every time they're seeking a new clinician, that they're telling a story to someone who's not invested in who they are, may have some conscious and unconscious biases just by looking at them and not believing their words. And here they are having this concern, and their concerns are not sort of being, not being taken upon as serious, and they're not getting the diagnosis for their loved one. And then again, it's quite circular. So imagine if you're this parent and this is your journey, it's not a good one. The folks that you're interacting with don't look like you, don't understand your language, may not understand how your own culture plays a role in how you might even view an autism diagnosis, how your support system, meaning other family members, your church, or whoever, your community that you might be living in, may not even, your language that you speak at home may not have a word for autism. And so not understanding what's happening for your family, for your loved one, then impacts, their ability to continue to advocate for their child and advocate for themselves. And this spills over into, that now their child is of school age and going to school. And that experience impacts the relationship they have with teachers, principals, and other supports. Like, their child might need ABA therapy or speech therapy, physical therapy, or whatever the case may be, even seeking out other medical professionals like dentists, eye doctors, things like that. They're less likely to seek that out due to this sort of really challenging process in just getting the diagnosis. So the impacts are quite huge. And so hopefully at some point, Canada will do some investigations on data related to race and BIPOC communities getting a diagnosis of autism or other diagnoses, but is quite impactful, as you can see.
Yeah. And I hope that answered the question about why talk about bias in the first place. Speaking, what you spoke about, Shelley, I think isn't just limited to of course, the Black community. Neeran, you spoke, you work specifically with the South Asian community, and I'm wondering if there are similar challenges that Shelley mentioned, and more specific challenges around the access for parents and caregivers with children that have ASD?
Absolutely. So speaking on behalf of SAAAC, I'm going to discuss some of the barriers that we've seen with some of the families. And it's something that we never really think about, but hopefully we can just have more of a discussion here. I'll give you some examples of some of the families we've seen and some of their particular situations. For example, we have families who can't afford a car. They can't afford insurance for a car. So they may live, quite far away from the actual center. So it's very difficult for them to attend programming. So that becomes a barrier that a lot of people don't consider because they may have the opportunity to be in a car. I'm just going to throw the question out there to see if anyone would be willing to answer, but what type of barrier is this called when people can't get to the center because they can't afford it in a more convenient way? So I'm not sure if the question was answered, but it is called transportation barriers. We work with a lot of families who have never been taught how to drive or are afraid of driving. When they consider a bus, the bus system takes a very long time to get to the SAAAC Autism Center. So we have to find ways to support these families so that we can be more creative and innovative with our programming. Another type of barrier could be that there's a lot of attitudinal barriers as well. And I'm not just talking about general communities or societies. I'm talking even within our culture, even within the South Asian culture. I think we spoke about there isn't a word for autism in many South Asian languages, and that promotes a lot of confusion because what we've come across is that some families could have their child or loved one be diagnosed with autism, and automatically there's this stigma that maybe there is some judgment on the parenting, maybe there is some judgment of or misunderstanding of why autism is occurring or prevalent in today's day and age. But specifically with cultures, there seems to be a lot of attitudinal barriers where families are a bit maybe embarrassed of going out to weddings or family gatherings because oh, they're bringing that child, so we all got to be on our tippy toes to make sure that we can accommodate that child. Barriers can exceed far beyond that. I think even some individuals who have mobility issues can go over to or try and get a train, and when they are in a wheelchair and they come up to a flight of stairs, it's a very inaccessible structure, and that becomes an architectural issue where we're not being inclusive in our buildings. We're not improving our access for individuals who need this type of support and these changes in our systems. I think the question before was, why do we talk about these biases? These biases have been accentuated because of our biases. These systems are created, and therefore it makes things very inaccessible for people who need the support. I think in that question we talked about, why don't we talk about equitable approaches? And I think equity is the solution, or one of the solutions in which we can make programming more accessible. At SAAAC Autism Center, for example, we are hosting a caregiver coaching program where it is virtually set, where parents don't have to come into the center, but we're providing support and strategies for the families so that we can make their home environments more equitable and more inclusive for their loved ones, so that these families can be more empowered. The caregivers and the leaders of these families are more empowered, and therefore that will pay forward. It'll ensure that all the other, for example, siblings, grandparents, uncles, aunties, everyone involved can be heavily influenced by this passion for these caregivers. And I have to give a lot of credit to a lot of the parents who are supporting their loved ones and their children who have exceptionalities, because as a parent myself, I can appreciate how challenging that may be. And I think when we have these discussions about barriers, we have to be, again, aware of these barriers so that we can dissect it and ensure that there's some sort of strategy or solutions or a way in order to overcome such barriers that I just mentioned.
It's interesting because as an English speaker, as somebody who grew up in Canada, I think I can admit to not even thinking about how transportation could be a barrier, because I have access, but how much more challenging it is if you are a caregiver for someone with ASD. There was a comment, and thank you very much for the participant who shared that very comment that you made, Neeran. But even things as simple as language, and having the language to be able to speak to these issues. There was a question in the chat about how language is interconnected with theory of mind and neurodiversity. But what if you're not even a native English speaker, or English is not your first language? How does that become a challenge, and what can we do to overcome some of those things?
I think when we're working with the caregivers at the SAAAC Autism Center, we do work with a lot of individuals who are immigrants. They have recently come over to Canada looking for more opportunities for their children. And what happens is we have probably clinicians that are heavily involved and heavily invested in working with their children. But I think clinicians and support workers and everybody that's trying to do their very best to support our communities are trained in their own culture. They are trained in their own language. I've had experience as a behavioral consultant, and there are terms that we all know as, if we're in the behavioral world, as positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. If I were to try and explain this to someone who comes from Africa, what these terms are, I may fully know. I passed the test. I got to the point where I understand thoroughly what these terms mean. But trying to explain it to somebody else who has their own culture and their own language is very, very challenging. So I think it's important, again, equity and inclusion are some of the ways that we can combat some of these issues, but we are attempting to focus on something called graphic facilitation. Graphic facilitation involves visuals rather than words. So we are creating our reports, we're creating our feedback with the caregivers in a more visual format, so that parents, regardless of what language they speak, are informed of some of these strategies so that it's easily communicated. Another example of someone who might have neurodivergent needs, who, for example, doesn't have the ability to attend to a conversation like we're having right now, what we did at our social enterprise is that we converted all of our instructions into video. We have taken that element out where if I were to talk to you, your attention span may not be as high as mine, or mine may not be as high as yours. So we're creating videos for all of our processes so that individuals who have trouble understanding verbal instructions or conversations can now refer to a video so that they can understand their role within our social enterprise. So I do love, a model that has been recently discovered. It's called the creativity and innovation model. And this model incorporates diversity and it utilizes the ideas of diverse individuals. And what it does is that it also makes things very equitable. If someone comes to the social enterprise at Goodness Gift and they need, for example, a communication device, we're going to do our very best to train the staff, to inform all of the participants or their fellow coworkers that this individual needs a communication device to speak. And we're going to embed that within our social enterprise. The more creative and the more innovative we are, I think that's what's going to help us move forward in the right direction.
Taryn, you've had quite a lot of success with some of the accommodation or the approaches that Neeran has just mentioned, and that's had a big impact on your clients too. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that, about what you've done that's similar to what Neeran has spoken about.
Absolutely. I think visuals and alternative approaches, they're key to any treatment and anything that we do. The premise around the program that I'm in, our community options program, is to go out into the community to break down some of those barriers so that, we're not just using conversations and verbal prompts. We're actually doing things like going into a coffee shop and practicing ordering food or ordering coffee, doing things like the actual actions of laundry or folding clothes. The best place to practice these things are actually at laundromats, actually in their homes. So when we look at barriers, like Neeran was talking about in terms of transportation, or we look at barriers around language, we find other alternatives to be able to teach whatever that skill is. I think a lot of my clients over the years, they've been able to communicate in so many different ways. And I've learned along this journey that, it's not just about creating a report and handing it off as a clinician and saying, go at it, this is what you got to do. It's about really outreaching to the family, recognizing, are there other individuals in the family that can support a plan? Are there other individuals in the community that can support whatever this might look like? We do things like support circles where we can gather up individuals that, whether they are teachers, whether they're the post office worker, anybody that we know has an interest in our participant. How can we utilize that support, whether it's just, offering words of encouragement, you can do this, versus, previously we've done workshops around visuals where we make them so that they are there's something that is just specifically for that individual, whether it's reminders, whether it's a simple card they can keep in their wallet, little things like that that might help them to understand either mainstream rules or things that might be harder for them to kind of keep track of. And the nice thing is that we involve everybody, including the participant. So the participant has an opportunity to really be a part of what that looks like. So if it is, let's say, reminders for the classroom, we look at not just, a visual board up in the front of the classroom or somewhere else. We look at ways that they're successful in their home, the other things, so that we can then generalize it to other environments. So very similar to what Neeran is talking about, we really try to involve all of these pieces in making their treatment whole.
There was a question from the audience. Does the Geneva Centre and SAAAC offer services in other languages?
We are attempting. We just completed a survey with our local community in terms of how important translation services would be for an organization like SAAAC. And I think we're about to launch a program very soon. We believe that translation services should be attached to our intake system or our intake processes. We want to come off organization that is very multicultural, and we are utilizing actually the services of seniors. We're recruiting seniors to help facilitate this transition program. Within this, and the reason why seniors are so important is a couple of reasons. We wanted to ensure that seniors were not viewed as how they're typically viewed, but very adaptive. They can be very responsive when given responsibilities, and I think they can take this program a lot of areas. I think it'll be very valuable to SAAAC. And we're gonna launch this program just to ensure that there is a role, there's a place for seniors within the SAAAC Autism Center. It's so important for seniors to hold on to their culture, to hold on to their language, to share the values of those different cultures over to other generations. So we thought the translation services would be facilitated by seniors, and I think it's going to help a lot of immigrants who are coming to Toronto, and Toronto is known as one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And I think knowing that landscape is so important. And I think if we can adapt and create programs that utilize that passion, I think it's vitally important.
And at the Geneva Centre, I just want to sort of, we're similar. We try our best to sort of provide support in the language that the family speaks. And one of the things we've done actually this year, which is quite exciting. And so typically it's, for those one-off meetings, if we're doing an intake, or a family might have a meeting with a clinician at the center, we ensure that the right translation supports are there. What we haven't done in the past, which we are piloting this year, is to offer a full-length service in the language that the family speaks. And so one of the services that we offer at Geneva Centre is behavior consultation. It's a 12-week service that families come in, and they might be looking to sort of, their child might be exhibiting like a problematic behavior that they want to see less of, or want the behavior to be reduced greatly. So they would come to us for 12 weeks, and they work with a clinician the clinician supports the family in looking at the behavior, the strategies that the families can utilize to sort of help manage that behavior at home. And so we've been piloting this year. We were lucky enough to get a grant to be able to access some professional translation services. And so we're actually offering this 12-week service in the language that the family speaks. And so we're midway through right now. Parent report, as we've been checking in on, how this is going, has been great, because in the past, these would be families that do qualify for our service, but we'd actually have to turn down because their English isn't such that be able to sort of benefit from the service being offered in English. And our current staff on that particular team, English is their primary language. And so the reports have been quite positive from the family, that they were not turned away based on them not being able to speak English. And though the service looks a little bit different in the sense that you've got this additional person in that isn't necessarily a clinician. And so sometimes I like your idea, Neeran, around using elders within communities and cultures to provide that lens. So I'm going to keep that in mind. So I'm learning something as well. And the service takes a little bit longer. And so the service might end up being maybe 14 or 16 weeks, because having that additional piece of translating everything that we say does take longer, but we want to still be able to provide the fulsome service, and then also additional just costs on our end, not costs for the family, but for us in translating any written documents. We try and leave, whether it's visuals or reports, getting all of that translated, but definitely has been worthwhile. I'm glad we did embark on this pilot this year, and we're hoping to sort of continue that in our coming years as well.
And it looks like you are getting a lot of support in the comments and the Q&A for bringing in the elders and responding to cultural nuances. And it's really heartening to talk about culturally responsive supports that are available to families that are out there. I wonder if we could turn it around a little bit, and if the audience at any time we have a few minutes left would like to put a question in the Q&A, please do. But how do we, what can parents and caregivers do to advocate for their child or the person that they're supporting who lives with ASD in the first place? If there are these barriers, what advice do you have for people in order to access the services that both Geneva Centre and SAAAC offers?
I think I've had the pleasure of working with so many incredible parents and caregivers, and one of the things that I have discovered with them is how powerful they are as an advocate. If they can remain an advocate for their loved ones, I think we're on the right track. With advocacy, we can now figure out how we can get that support, and we can connect with organizations like the ones we're putting up on the resources and support slide. Once you start connecting with these agencies, and once you start realizing that you're in a tribe that's like-minded and has the similar passions, I think there's a lot of strength in numbers. And I think if we were to go in that direction, it's going to help us understand something called emotional intelligence. I think when we wake up in the morning and we're so overwhelmed with all of these processes and these systems and these judgments, then it becomes very difficult to wake up, in the morning and get to work and, be a father or a friend or a son or anything like that. But I think it's very important to connect with people, as I mentioned, who are like-minded to help you get that emotional support. There's a lot of emotion in these conversations that we're having because it is unjust, it is unfair, and as I mentioned, it's tragic. But the only way that we can do this is we socially connect, we socially work together, we collaborate, we incorporate diversity within our systems. We focus on inclusion, where all these ideas is not viewed as like maybe next time. We have to go in this fight, or in this constant overcoming these barriers, with the understanding that these diverse needs or diverse ideas is a need. It's the only way that we're going to solve some of these injustices that are happening. If we can go in that direction, I think we can have also an honest self-appraisal. We can understand what we can do about it and what we can't do about it. And if we can understand that, then there's less pressure on ourselves to solve all the world's problems. But I think, again, going back to the question, it's a really powerful question. Why do we talk about these biases? It's important to identify the problem first. If we identify the problem, fence off that problem, we can work around that, and we can work together to solve that problem.
I think as well, Neeran, I wanted to sort of add that, I loved everything that you just said around, feeling secure in your own advocacy for your child, your loved one, your family member. But for those of us on the call today that might be in a position of power, like myself, I'm a director at an agency, and yourself, all of us, right? We too play a role. So it's twofold. It's in empowering our families, building their capacity to advocate for themselves in a way that they know is right, in a way that's right for them and their families. But also we have a responsibility as people in positions of power that work in these institutions that create these structures that families come to us to ensure that we too are doing the work. Again, Neeran, using you as an example, I'm learning today as well, even though I'm a panelist myself, the amount of work that SAAAC has gone into in making those reports more accessible. You're saying using visuals, making meetings more accessible, sharing information about your family. So regardless of who your families are in contact with at SAAAC, they're getting, everyone is aware. So families, again, don't have to repeat their story over and over and over and over and over, which is exhausting for families, and they shouldn't have to do that. So we always have to remember too that because we do hold a position of power, that responsibility and accountability really does lie with us. And we too have to do the work, even if it's work. It's work, it takes time, it takes creativity, problem solving. Sometimes we try something, it doesn't work the first time, and that doesn't mean then, oh, well, we can't do it. We keep trying. It doesn't mean that if our entire agency, the staff there, all primarily speak English, we have to find other ways to bring those cultures, those languages into our agencies, into our services, so that families find us open and accessible. We have to also go into the communities, right? And so I find if you think about an agency, Geneva Centre is about a building on a street, we have an address, and there is that sort of, expectation that people come to us. This is where the service is. And I'm really looking at ourselves as getting GCA out in the community. You shouldn't have to come to us. Transportation, difficulties aside, like we should be in the communities because families live in communities, they're neighborhoods, right? And so alongside community centers and neighborhood centers and things like that is so very important. So responsibilities on both sides.
Absolutely. And if I could just add briefly, I think when people are in positions of power, my recommendation, if anyone were to ask me, talk to strangers, get to know people, really start understanding people. I think once you start to do that and you incorporate these ideas and their lived experiences into what you do, I think you're going to have even more of an influence in our communities and hopefully the world. We are working, within Scarborough, but our CEO has already mentioned we want to take our programs, wherever we can, wherever it's needed. And I think that people like my CEO as Keith Morsi, who has this drive, who has this mission, has this passion. I think, leaders like that should be highlighted for the work that they're doing, because we can all follow suit and we can follow and we can, hang on to this passion, and then we can deal with problems like this.
If I can just add really quickly, when we think of advocacy, it needs to be a fluid conversation. It needs to be something that, it starts off with our children and newly diagnosed, and we're working with our families, but it moves up to the individual. And as we work with those individuals, we need to look from our lens as clinicians, as professionals, as caregivers, how are we empowering those individuals to speak to, what they want to see in their future? How do they have a voice? And I think that that's the most important thing. I work with individuals who every single day tell me about their experiences, and we talk about how can I take hold of what that looks like and advocate for who I am and who I want people to see me as, not the various intersectionalities and biases that are around us. So if I can just leave you with that, I think that that's something that's super important that we want to keep in the back of our heads, in the front of our heads, I should say, at all times.
I actually think that's a great way to wrap. And it's an important lesson that all of us can carry because we're all part of this. And so I'd like to thank our panelists today, Neeran Kuni, Taryn Prasad, and Shelley Brazier, for the very heartfelt and thought-provoking conversation that we had today. I'd also like to thank Rachel Ward Maxwell for the technical support behind the scenes to help us bring this virtual event to you today. There were a lot of resources that were posted on the screen in the chat. We would, as usual, like you to take a few minutes at the end of this event to answer a short survey for us. The survey link should be posted in the chat. And if you registered, you will be receiving it by email. A recording of this webinar and previous sensory-friendly Saturday recordings can be found on our website, www.ontariosciencecentre.ca. Please don't forget to follow, share, and like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and YouTube. Please do see the resources that are available through the Geneva Centre for Autism website, as well as SAAAC.org's website. I'd like to thank all of you again for joining us today for this final virtual sensory-friendly Saturday virtual event of 2021. And we hope to see you again at a future Ontario Science Centre event. My name is Rochelle Fillart. Thank you and have a great day.